spectacular day. In the first interview, I sit down with Robert Kennedy Jr. And I have to tell you that I had never been so impressed, so overwhelmed, and so emotionally moved around this vaccine issue as I was during the course of that conversation. It was mind-boggling. Next, I sit down with Scott and Melissa Miller. They are filmmakers and have a legacy of filmmaking in California. They stumbled across the vaccine issue in a very unique way relative to the anthrax vaccine and the military. You want to see their interview because we're going to be hosting their film, Vaccine Syndrome, in episode 6 of Vaccines Revealed. This is the first time this movie has ever been seen. And then to close out today's episode with some real power, we are screening a 20-minute version of the movie Vaxxed. And Vaxxed is a movie that created quite a dust-up, quite a stir out there in the world and in the media because it was submitted and accepted to be shown in the Tribeca Film Festival, but then was yanked because of the outcry by the media and all these other pseudoscientists who said that people will be hurt if they see this film. Why? Because they might learn something about vaccines that's true that they don't know. So Vaxxed has become an iconic film in this vaccine movement. And I have to tell you that this 20-minute version is very powerful, and we are very proud in Vaccines Revealed to have a strategic alliance with those filmmakers and the people who participated in that film. So enjoy today's episode. Bobby, thanks very much for taking some time to talk to us about this very important subject today. What got you interested in mercury in the first place? I know you've been very active in environmental issues, but how did you specifically get involved in mercury, and then how did it further bring you to vaccines?
I got dragged into the vaccine issue very reluctantly. I was suing coal-burning power plants all across America. I'm the president of Waterkeeper Alliance, which is the biggest water protection group in the world, and we have 300 waterkeepers, each one with a patrol boat patrolling local waterways. And a lot of them were involved in litigation against coal-burning power plants, which is one of the biggest air polluters, but also the biggest water polluter. And probably, besides acid rain and global warming and ozone and particulates, one of the categories of pollutants that is associated with emissions from coal-burning power plants is mercury. Mm-hmm. And as a result, principally of mercury emissions from coal-burning power plants, there's widespread contamination of fish, and particularly freshwater fish in the United States. The FDA has found that every freshwater fish in the United States now has dangerous levels of mercury in its flesh. And largely as a result of that, according to CDC, 1 out of every 6 American women has enough mercury in their body to create a reduced IQ in their children. Mm-hmm. So I was litigating at one point against, I think, over 30 coal-burning power plants. And I was lecturing around the country. And whenever I was lecturing to large audiences, almost all the time that I would give a speech, there would be women in the audience who would come up to me afterwards and say, if you're genuinely interested in mercury toxicity and exposure, you need to look at the mercury in vaccines, because that is by far the largest vector for exposure, particularly to young children who are the most vulnerable cohort. And this was an issue that I didn't want to get into. I'd always been pro-vaccine. I had all 6 of my children vaccinated. I had no expertise in that area of public health and really very little knowledge about it. But they asked me to read the science, and particularly one woman who approached me, who was a friend of my brother's wife, my sister-in-law, Vicki Kennedy, and her name was Sarah Bridges, and she had a vaccine-injured child who had autism and who had been given a large award, a large settlement from the vaccine court after 8 years of litigation. And she was very knowledgeable, very smart, and very centered. And she actually gave me some of the science. and she asked me to read it. And I kind of did it as a favor to her and to my sister-in-law. I started reading the science. And one of the features of this issue, one of the kind of Kafkaesque features of this issue, is that most people don't read the science. You know, you hear this absolute insistence by both government agencies and medical doctors and the press that the science has exonerated Mercury from any involvement with autism or any of these other neurodevelopmental disorders that we're seeing now epidemic in American children. But when you ask them, what study are you talking about? I have never, literally never had anybody be able to name me a study that they had read. So even the abstracts people don't read. But I'm very comfortable reading science. My interest in environmental law had started with an interest in science. And I've brought hundreds and hundreds of environmental cases and won them, and almost all of them involve scientific controversy. So if I was not comfortable reading science, I couldn't have, done well in those cases. So I started reading the science, and what I found almost immediately is that, although there was this insistence that there were no studies out there that linked mercury in vaccines to neurodevelopmental disorders, and particularly to autism, that there are actually many, many studies. There were literally hundreds of studies showing that thimerosal was very destructive of brain tissue and other and caused other human illnesses as well, and animal illnesses, cadaver damage, all this kind of stuff. There was lots and lots of studies out there. There was a very, very rich scientific literature that anybody could access on PubMed. Mm-hmm. But specifically, there were also many studies that linked it to autism, which was shocking because there was such a huge delta between the public perception of what the science said and the government characterization of the science and what the science was actually saying when I read it.
Do you have any premise as to why that is? I mean, why, as you said, this is very searchable, very available, and it's pretty obvious, the connections are there. Yet somehow there's this public perception that that autism and mercury are not related relative to the vaccine issue. How do you think that disconnect happened?
I think that there's a number of factors, and there, and it's almost like this. It's like when you're talking with the press, it's like dealing with the Borg. It's kind of cocoon of denial that really is it's a journalistic malpractice. But there are two reasons, I think, principal reasons for it. One is a bad reason, which is there's a huge amount of money going to the pharmaceutical industry from the press. Yeah. In fact, the president of one network told me, Fox News, Roger Ailes, who is an old friend of mine, who I spent a couple of months with in a tent when I was 19 years old in Africa, and I've had this kind of weird friendship with him ever since. But he was very sympathetic to the issue, but he said, listen, during some parts of non-election years, a huge portion, I think he said 70% of advertising revenues can come from pharmaceutical companies for the news division. He said, I would have to fire any of my hosts who allowed you on TV if they lost an advertiser. And he said, and if I did that, I would get a call from Rupert within 10 minutes. Mm. So I think that is a consideration. You've had this huge consolidation of the press in our country. There's now essentially 6 companies that control almost all the newspapers, all the television stations, all the radio stations, and most of the large internet content providers in America. And almost all those companies are getting a very, very large portion of their advertising revenue from the pharmaceutical and from vaccine makers. Right. So that's a bad reason. I think that the reporters on the beat and many of the editors as well, think that they are performing a critical public function, which is to increase vaccination rates. And they believe that the consequence of allowing debate about vaccine safety would be detrimental to public health, and that, actually, I've heard this many times, that we would be killing children. Because if people don't vaccinate, children die. So, you have that, which in some cases, that is a mythology that really needs to be parsed and, explored, and it's not being explored. Unfortunately, the consequence of removing scrutiny from the vaccine industry and from the government officials who regulate it has not been to increase the safety or the popularity of the vaccine program. In fact, the opposite has been true. It has incentivized the worst kind of behaviors by both pharmaceutical companies who are making these vaccines and by the regulators who are often, part of a captive agency phenomena. CDC is really part of the vaccine industry. It's I would say a wholly owned subsidiary of the vaccine industry. And that's not hyperbole. CDC is actually buys and sells over $4 billion worth of vaccines annually. And if the demand for those vaccines is reduced, there are severe economic consequences for the agency. So they have to sell those vaccines, and they have to create demand for them. And they have the capacity to create demand for them. And both CDC and FDA also are partners in, own vaccine patents. In addition to that, the advisory committees that control the vaccine program are not made up entirely of CDC employees, but they're mainly composed of people who have direct financial ties to the vaccine industry, and in some cases, huge financial incentives to add new vaccines to the schedule. For example, the committee that is in charge of adding new vaccines to the schedule. When I was a boy, I only got 3 vaccines. My children got 69 doses of about 20 vaccines. And the committee that adds those new vaccines to the schedule is called the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, and it's mainly made up of people who are vaccine industry insiders. And I'll give you an example. In 1999, Paul Offit, who is who is a vaccine industry spokesperson and insider, and is on the payroll of Merck, which is the biggest vaccine producer in our country, was sat on the Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices when it and voted to add the rotavirus vaccine to the schedule. Offit at that time was working on a patent for his rotavirus vaccine, and yet he did not recuse himself. They added that vaccine to the schedule. That created a market for an opening for his vaccine, which then became enormously profitable as a direct result of that vote. And he was able to sell that vaccine patent for about $186 million 6 years later. And he profited enormously. He's never disclosed how much he made, but looking at the industry practices, it was probably something around the order of $29 million. That transaction caused a kind of a scandal at HHS and CDC, and the Inspector General of HHS investigated that practice. And what they came back and said, that transaction was bad, but it was not illegal under CDC rules. And in fact, up to 97% of the people who sit on that committee may have the same kind of conflicts.
Wow.
They found that 64% actually had the conflicts, but at 97% either had the conflicts or hadn't filled out the paperwork to make the legal disclosures about whether or not they had those conflicts. It's hard to, for Americans who've watched their vaccine schedule increase exponentially to completely have faith that all of these vaccines are being added and get to the schedule and then given to their children at a very young age in most cases, simply, because of a narrow focus on public health. When people are actually, making money from these transactions, the people who are making decisions over that vaccine policy are making personal profit on it. And, I think those are conflicts that I think if the American people knew about them, would leave a bad taste in people's mouths.
Yeah, well, it's kind of unprecedented because you have the federal government with taxpayer dollars indemnifying the private vaccine manufacturers in the first place, right? And then you've got people making decisions about the vaccines who have a conflict of interest. And then you have the government agency, the CDC, who basically is becoming, they're distributing the vaccines for them, and they have a budget for it that their agency relies upon. I mean, when you look at the constellation that forms, it's pretty disturbing, especially because it's directly affecting, especially children, and what's happening to them.
As I said, when I was a kid, I got 3 vaccines. My children got up to 69 vaccines. And the schedule changed mainly in 1989. The reason it changed is because in 1986, Congress passed the Vaccine Act, which went into effect the following year in 87. The Vaccine Act exempted or immunized, gave blanket immunity to the vaccine industry from any kind of liability. So no matter how reckless they behave, no matter how dangerous or toxic the ingredients or unnecessary the ingredients of the vaccine, no matter how egregious and grievous the injury to the child, no company is liable. Which means not only do they avoid the liability, but they also avoid the discovery, the depositions, the document searches, all those things that would explore and scrutinize the decision-making that are taking place in that vaccine company.
I never thought of that. So there's no discovery.
No, there's no
either.
No, and the vaccine court doesn't allow any kind of discovery. So, and you want to see how these same companies, these pharmaceutical companies, are behaving when they have this big defense bar looking over their shoulders and suing them and getting, $100 million and $1 billion settlements year after year, or judgments year after year for their pharmaceutical products. Why would that same company behave any differently when it comes to vaccines? And of course, the answer is they don't. Right. The thing is that nobody's looking at them, and nobody's allowed to look at them. And not only that, but the Congress not only made it very easy, made them immune from any liability, but they also made it very easy to bring a vaccine to market, so you don't have all these kind of burdensome hoops and impediments in testing. You don't have, for example, double-blind placebo testing of big populations that a normal pharmaceutical would have. Some of these products are brought to market with almost no testing whatsoever. When Congress passed that law, prior to that, when I was a boy, nobody was making money on vaccines. In fact, some of the vaccines that I got didn't even have patents. There was almost a civic duty for the pharmaceutical industry. Beginning in 1987, suddenly, this was pay dirt. Vaccines became pay dirt for the industry, and the Vaccine Act launched a gold rush in the vaccine business, because the vaccine company, the pharmaceutical company, suddenly realized, hey, here's a product. And essentially, effectively, the federal government is requiring 100 million people, and state governments 100 million people to purchase it. You can't send your kids to school unless they have it. The profit margins were huge on vaccines. You had no liability. You had no advertising. You had no marketing costs. and there's no consequence to injuring or hurting anybody. So you have this extraordinary product, and there was a rush to add new vaccines to the schedule, and the industry got a hold of the advisory committee on immunization practices, and within a few years they had not only added all of these vaccines to the schedule, but they had dramatically increased the mercury exposures, and nobody ever did a mass loading analysis of how much mercury is. So mercury, the typical mercury exposure to a typical American child went from 70 micrograms per child before age 2 to 237 micrograms. And that year, 1989, you suddenly saw the beginning of this epidemic of neurological disorders that we're seeing among American children today. ADD. All of these diseases that were either rare or unheard of when I was a boy suddenly became an epidemic. ADD, ADHD, speech delay, tics, misery disorder, which I'd never heard of before reading it in the scientific literature, narcolepsy, Tourette's syndrome, tics, which is that family of grave neurological disorders, seizure disorder, and then also anaphylaxis, food allergies, and asthma that happened at the same time. And all of that began and autism and ASD. The autism rates went from 1 in 2,500 to 1 today, 1 in 68, as the vaccine schedule expanded. And EPA scientists have identified 1989 as the gateway year, the year that all of these unknown diseases suddenly launched. And, it's clear that, particularly for something like autism, which the scientific literature clearly associates with mercury exposure, not just vaccine mercury, but mercury in fish, mercury acridinea, which was in many ways almost identical, had the same biomarkers as autism, and that was from calomel tooth powders, which were mercurial. Mercury in amalgams, mercury emissions from coal-burning power plants. There are many, many studies that show that the closer you live to a mercury-emitting plant, the higher that your chances are of having autism. So we know that mercury causes it. And suddenly you had this dramatic explosion of autism. And, if somebody says, well, it could be something else, we know it has to be an environmental toxin because it's an epidemic. And genes do not cause epidemics. So genes can create the vulnerability, but you need an environmental toxin. So the question is, what is an environmental toxin that had this dramatic exposure beginning in 1989 across every demographic, from urban blacks and Cuban Americans and whites in Miami, Florida, to Inuit in Homer, Alaska, and everybody in between. Everybody except, incidentally, unvaccinated cohorts, like the Amish, who were not getting it. And not only that, you have to also identify a toxin that affects boys on a 4-to-1 ratio to girls. So, you can people say, well, maybe it's glyphosate, which is from, Roundup, from the pesticide. And certainly, that's not a good thing to put in somebody that may aggravate autism, and it may cause it itself. But glyphosate was around a lot longer than that. Even the MMR vaccine was, we were giving since the mid-'70s. So you have to look, and some people point at that, and that again may trigger autism, but something else is involved. Something is creating the precondition for it that allows other environmental triggers to trigger it. And there's very good science that says that if you expose somebody to mercury, that you get these mitochondrial disorders that then can be triggered into autism later on by some other environmental insult. But the mercury is the primary culprit.
You have a vast legal background. Is there any other scenario in law relative to the government, et cetera, where this type of a circumstance exists, or is this completely unique, where you've got an industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry, indemnified by the government, who's got kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card, for all of their actions?
There's nobody who has any deal like this. Yeah. There's no other industry who has this kind of deal where they have a blanket immunity from liability. I mean, the government does indemnify certain industries that, for example, the nuclear power industry has a kind of indemnity as well. Okay. Nobody has an indemnity like like the pharmaceutical. And of course, it's been very lucrative for the industry. Yeah. This is now a $30 billion industry. Wow. And if you can get a vaccine on the schedule, it can be $1 billion annual profit for your company. So the incentives to get it on there are enormous. And then no liability forever. There's no other pharmaceutical drug that can give you those returns with no liability.
Yeah, it's incredible. Now, you mentioned Dr. Offit earlier, who's a vaccine advocate. You had a personal conversation with him. Could you recount that?
Well, very early on, what I do when I'm trying to learn a new area of science is that I do the reading and then I call the expert. It's very, very hard to just read scientific papers or the abstracts of those papers. Mm-hmm. Without somebody to help you understand the context. Different papers have different weight. There's good science and there's bad science, and you can't always spot it without context. So I always call the people on both sides of an issue to try to figure out what the truth is. Ultimately, that's what we're trying to do, is to search for existential truths. And I called one of the chief managers at the Institute of Medicine, Kathleen Stratton, and I called Paul Offit very early on. After I had done some reading of the science, I had questions about what CDC was saying on its website and its public statements. One of the things that CDC was saying, the principal thing they say, and to this day, it says this on their website, says that we all, one of the big conundrums I think that CDC has is that everybody knows that mercury in fish is bad for you. Mm-hmm. So in every state and nationally, there are advisories, for example, to pregnant women to limit their intake of fish, and particularly certain kinds of fish. Mm-hmm. And the reason is because the methylmercury that is in fish is known to create all kinds of problems with the baby. It's teratogenic, it's mutagenic, it's carcinogenic, it causes low IQ and all these other neurological deficits and disorders. The immediate question that occurred to me, and I'm very familiar with that, immediate question that occurred to me is, how can we be telling mothers not to eat fish, and yet, because of the mercury, and yet we're injecting them and their little babies immediately upon birth with mercury in vaccines, and with doses far higher than the doses we give advisory for on fish, in some cases hundreds of times higher. And so I asked Offit that, and I asked Kathleen Stratton that, and both of them gave me the same story, and it's the story that you can read on CDC's website to this day. Mm-hmm. And that story is that, and it's an old industry canard, that ethylmercury is not as toxic as methylmercury because it does not have the residency time in the body. In other words, it's excreted by the body so quickly that it doesn't have time to do any damage. Mm-hmm. And when I asked Offit for the scientific study that showed that, because the industry's been saying that for 80 years with no science. In 2004, a CDC scientist called Picciero, actually did a study that showed that the mercury the ethyl mercury from vaccines disappears from the blood in about a week. Whereas the methyl mercury from fish remains in a child's blood for 54 days.
Okay.
And that superficially tended to support the argument that it's excreted quickly. But that study immediately came under attack because people wrote letters and articles saying, wait a second, Picciero never showed where this mercury was going.
Right.
He didn't find mercury in the feces or the sweat or the fingernails or the hair or the urine of these children. The question is, where is it going?
Right.
Is it really being excreted from the body? And then another scientist, about 2 years later, called Thomas Burbacker, and a big team of scientists did studies on macaque monkeys, where they actually fed them methylmercury, and then they injected another group with ethylmercury from vaccines, and what they found was that indeed the ethylmercury from the vaccines disappeared from the macaque blood almost immediately. When they autopsied the macaques, they found it was not leaving the body. The reason it was leaving the bloodstream is because it very easily crossed the blood-brain barrier, and it was going directly to the brain. So rather than proving that it was safe, the capacity of that ethylmercury to leave the blood quickly was actually evidence of its extraordinary danger, because it was not leaving the children, it was going into their brains. And Burbacker's study showed that it metabolized into a form of mercury that's called organic mercury, which is the kind that's really toxic, that causes terrible inflammation and neurological death and neurological damage in the brain, and that it metabolized into organic mercury at twice the rate. So it was twice as persistent in the brain as the methylmercury in fish. And then an Italian scientist called Tosi a few years later found that when you measured ethylmercury against methylmercury, that ethylmercury was actually 50 times as toxic as methylmercury in the brain. The mercury in vaccines is twice persistent and 50 times as toxic as the methylmercury in fish. When I asked Offit the question, how can you say that ethylmercury in vaccines is safe? He said to me, well, Bobby, we know that it's excreted from the body very quickly. And I said, what study are you talking about? And he cited Picciero, and I said, but have you read Burbacker? There was dead silence on the other end, and it was clear that he did understand the implications of my question. And then he began backtracking, and he said, well, you're right. There are problems with that theory, but it's really a whole mosaic of studies. And that's a quote from him, a whole mosaic of studies that show that the ethylmercury is safe. And when I asked him what other studies were part of that mosaic, he said that he would get back to me, and that's the last I heard from him. So I knew, and Kathleen Stratton was actually much more honest with me. Kathleen Stratton said, yeah, ethylmercury is bad. When you give thimerosal to mice, it makes them do weird things. When you give it to rats, it causes damage. When you give it to guinea pigs, it makes them act crazy. Clearly, it's not going to be good for humans. That's why we're taking it out of all the vaccines. So that were the two studies. We're taking it out. It's not in them anymore. And even if it was in them, it's excreted. And both of those things are a lie.
So after these conversations with these people who are charged with the public health, who know these things, as you just described, how do you think they live with themselves? I mean, there's literally little children being injured. They have this information, and they're trying to convince you that something is other than what is true.
I see that in the environmental arena a lot. People who are polluting, who seem to be good and decent people. And Upton Sinclair said that it's very difficult to convince a man of a fact if the existence of that fact will diminish his salary. I think a lot of us see the world through a lens of that is at least colored by self-interest.
Yeah.
You know, if you look at the transcripts of the Simpsonwood transcripts, which was the meeting that occurred when they realized, when they did a study of the biggest vaccine safety database in America, the healthcare records for hundreds of thousands of children, and they did an internal study in CDC, and they realized that they were causing the autism epidemic. This is 2001. They had a meeting, a secret meeting off campus at CDC, so that it couldn't be what they thought it would be immune from Freedom of Information law requests. And they had that meeting with 75 vaccine makers and key officials from all of the federal agencies, from FDA, from CDC, from NIH, the World Health Organization, et cetera, to decide how to handle this information. And it's really a fascinating study in human character. And my father was very interested, who was kind of a contemporary of World War II, and had been in the Navy, during the last year of the war, and very affected by, the discoveries about what the Nazis had done. He was always interested in how the circumstances that made good and decent people participate in holocausts and calamities, and catastrophes, and you see that in that transcript. You see it happening because when they first get the information, all of these people are horrified. There's one of them, famous Dr. Neil Halsey, who literally cried. And they say, how could this have happened? They say, were we asleep at the wheel? Why didn't we, this is childhood math, why didn't we look at these mercury loads? When we ordered all these new vaccines, how come we never did a mass loading analysis of the amount of mercury exposure that we were going to be giving to these kids? And there's a lot of mea culpas. And you have people at that time, we have an email trail as well, like Ruth Edsel, who is saying, we got to come clean. We've got to do the right thing. We've got to tell the American people. We've got to do our mea culpas. We've got to express our regret, our apology, and then we have to start rebuilding the credibility of the vaccine program. But by the second day of that meeting, these other voices had begun to assert themselves. And people say, well, if we do this, the lawyers will come out of the woodwork and they'll sue us. And, more importantly, they'll sue the vaccine companies, the pharmaceutical companies. And the implication was the pharmaceutical companies would just stop producing vaccines. And then, they begin to coalesce and say, we've got to hide this. We've got to keep this quiet. And by the end of the second day, all of these people, these, mature, public servants, suddenly at the end of that meeting, they're saying to each other, we've got to embargo this. We've got to hide this from the American people. And that's what they did. There's one very poignant moment where Robert Johnson, who's, I think, the head of Children's Hospital in Denver, or a similar hospital, stands up at the meeting and says, my daughter-in-law just had our first male grandson of our family line, and I'm not going to give him a vaccine. As long as there's some aerosol in it, I'm not going to give it to him. So they were telling each other, we know this is dangerous. We know what this study says. It's unambiguous. You can't massage it. There's nothing you can do. It's real. And then they're saying, we got to hide it. And then there's an email trail for the next year and a half coming out of IOM and CDC saying, how do we create new studies that will justify our point of view, that will show that there's no problems with, that there's no connection between autism and these other diseases. And so, you saw that, you see that whole, that cascade occur where the human behavior, the worst instincts, suddenly these survival instincts take a hold.
It's really almost unimaginable, especially because you're saying this is documented. I mean, it's not like...
That's very well.
It's not hearsay.
The vaccine program changed in 1989, around 1989, and the years after. And by the mid-1990s, they were seeing this cascade, this explosion of these neurodevelopmental disorders. So CDC had a giant repository of child health information. It's called the Vaccine Safety Database, and they spend $20 million a year maintaining this database, and it's exactly precisely for reasons like this, so that you can do epidemiological studies and identify the toxins, if there are some that are causing problems. So they brought in an in-house epidemiologist, whose name was Thomas Verstraeten, who started looking at the data. And his initial runs of the data were very clear that, yes, these new vaccine schedules, particularly the thimerosal, was causing the autism epidemic. He looked at the kids who had received 25 micrograms and less of thimerosal and compared those to kids who had 25 micrograms or more, and found a 760 relative risk. That means a 760% greater chance for the higher exposed group to get an autism diagnosis. One of the runs, he found an 1100 relative risk, 11.5 relative risk. And that's greater than the association between smoking a pack of cigarettes every day for 20 years and cancer. So they knew at that point what was causing the autism epidemic. Not only that, but they found similar associations for ADD, ADHD, tics, a speech delay, and a number of other neurodevelopmental disorders. Then clearly Verstraeten came under a lot of pressure to try to change those results. And you see these emails back and forth saying it just won't go away. Speaking of the autism signal, and him talking about, about how he's massaging the data and pushing it this way, but that whenever he pushes it this way, the signal continues to persist. And then they have the Simpsonwood meeting. And after the Simpsonwood meeting, you see this flood of emails saying, let's go to other countries. Countries where there's lower exposures of thimerosal. And let's do epidemiological studies. Now, the Institute of Medicine had said that the link between autism and vaccines and thimerosal is, quote, biologically plausible. They instructed CDC to do a range of studies, toxicological studies, biological studies, and clinical studies, and animal studies, etc. The CDC has never done any of those studies. Instead, CDC commissioned a series of epidemiological studies that mainly took place in foreign countries where the exposures to thimerosal were much less to start off with. And they took advantage of changing reporting requirements in those countries that gave the illusion that, for example, in Scandinavia, when thimerosal was banned in 1993, the autism levels actually climbed after the ban. So this was something CDC jumped on. The reason they climbed, however, was not because the incidence of autism was actually climbing, but it was an artifact of changing reporting requirements. Prior to 1993, the Danish government had only required in-house or inpatient cases of autism be reported to the National Disease Registry. Every nation has a National Disease Registry, every developed nation, so that it's a registry of contagious diseases. So that, for example, if you live in California and you go into your doctor with a measles case, he has to report that to the Department of Health. It's mandatory reporting. And for obvious reasons, we want to know where these, contagious diseases exist and how they're spreading. So, but autism in Scandinavia was never on that registry. It was never a mandatory reported disease because it wasn't contagious. So the only autism cases that were required to be reported were those people who were so debilitated by autism that they had to live inpatient. They were permanently hospitalized, essentially. So, and that was about 8% of the total cases. But in 1993, because autism was exploding in Scandinavia, again, because they had changed their vaccine schedule, they made it mandatory for everybody to report because they wanted to see what was happening in the numbers the same year that they banned thimerosal.
Wow.
Because of that, the disease registry showed that it looked like the number of cases of autism were actually increasing after thimerosal was banned, and CDC took advantage of that, and they sent a very, very corrupt data manager over there to make it look like the incident of autism was actually increasing. The data manager's name was Paul Thornton, and he actually stole the $1 million that CDC had given him to do this study. And he is now on the run in Europe. The FBI and the Justice Department have issued a 22-count indictment against him for fraud and for wire theft. And he's on the run from Interpol and the FBI in Europe. But CDC continues to tout that study as proof that thimerosal does not cause autism.
To this day, they're still touting it.
Yeah, to this day.
Now, you have filed suit against the CDC.
Well, what we've done is we filed a suit asking the CDC to to allow us to depose its senior vaccine safety scientist, whose name is Dr. William Thompson. Mm-hmm. And Dr. William Thompson has come forward and said on tape and also in a public statement that CDC has been essentially defrauding the public, has been manipulating data, destroying data, massaging data in its vaccine studies in order to deceive the American public and the public health community about the safety of thimerosal and other vaccines.
Wow. And because they've not let him testify or make a statement.
To this date, they are not allowing Dr. Thompson to speak publicly.
I found an irony because I had some email exchange with Dr. Thompson recently, and on the bottom in the CDC signature, it says, "Saving lives, protecting people," as their slogan. And it seems extraordinarily ironic in a tragic way that you want to try to get him to come out and talk about the things that he needs to be talking about.
Well, a lot of people, I think their first reaction is, this couldn't be true.
Right.
Why would the CDC do this? Why would they lie to us about the safety of vaccines? And it is astonishing. And you almost have to read the Simpsonwood transcripts to understand, what happened to the CDC and why these idealistic public servants, suddenly felt that they had to close ranks and protect the institution. But, in many ways, we see the analogies for this behavior in other realms. For example, the Catholic Church and the pedophile scandal.
Right.
Everybody got involved in it. Everybody got implicated in it. There was a relatively small number of priests who were actually raping children. Mm-hmm. But the bishops got involved because suddenly the institution became more important than the children that they were supposed to be protecting.
Right.
And it's the same thing here. And the CDC and the vaccine program have to be protected. And these people who are being injured are just sacrifices for the greater good. So, I think they got involved in that kind of perverse dynamic, but that at the time when they make these choices, they seem like rational choices to them and necessary choices, and they don't seem selfish and they don't seem evil to the person who's making it. But when we look at it from the outside, it's astonishing.
It is astonishing, and it's what I find, and you're the only person, and I've been having many conversations around all these issues, but I think this is the only time that I've really captured kind of the social dynamic and the psychodynamics around how people can collectively start to get on a certain track of thinking and almost trick themselves into thinking what they're doing is good. And the other references historically that show that this is not necessarily unprecedented, that human beings would convene and do this and convince themselves of such a thing.
I mean, and it happened, the same thing happened in many, many contexts. The NFL concussion scandal is another example, but throughout history, in fact, there's a word for it, which is called the Semmelweis effect. Mm-hmm. And it describes the same thing that happened to a doctor called Ignaz Semmelweis, who was the first person to advance theories of hygiene. Because he saw that women in hospitals in Austria were becoming were dying. Women who came in for childbirth were dying. And he realized that the people who were doing the autopsies were not cleaning their hands between doing that autopsy and actually delivering babies. And that the women, they were carrying something. This was before germ theory.
Right.
That they were carrying something with them from those corpses that was making the women sick. And it was killing huge numbers of them. I think 30 or 40% were dying in these hospitals. And he he did a study and instituted what we describe today as normal hygiene practices, and it reduced the numbers of deaths by exponentially. He then published a paper on it, and he was absolutely condemned and destroyed by the medical community, who said no, because who did not want to recognize that doctors who believed themselves to be people who were saving lives were actually contributing to these injuries and deaths. And he lost his license, and he was locked in a mental institution where he died mysteriously, 2 weeks later. Mm-hmm. So, we've seen this throughout history, and it happens. It's Paul Offit, when he spoke to me, he talked to me about how much he admired my father and how, it was my father's inspiration that led him to get into public service. And Kathleen Stratton said the same kind of things to me. So, and I felt, these are people who started out as idealistic and good people who are trying to help children, but they somehow got sucked into this vortex where they began justifying to themselves behaviors and conducts that, were ultimately socially malevolent.
Where do you hope to take this now, as far as, do you look to hold the CDC to account or any of these people to account, and what's the outcome that we can hope for?
The most important outcome, I think, that, the strategic outcome would be to get a public debate about this.
Yes.
Because the CDC cannot withstand a public debate. Mm-hmm. So all the things that I do are bent on forcing this debate out into the open, because once the science is in the open, the CDC's position is so fragile. And it's an edifice of fraud stacked upon fraud, and it's so high and so wobbly that even a slight breeze of public scrutiny will topple it. But that, the genius of what they've been able to do is to be able to stop all of that public scrutiny. And it's not only Congress that won't investigate them, and the regulatory agencies have been captured. The courts and the lawyers that would normally apply that scrutiny have been removed by the Vaccine Act. And the press has been compromised, and it's not just the mainstream corporate media, but also the so-called alternate media like Huffington Post and, Salon and Slate and Daily Beast and even Mother Jones that, for whom this is a taboo topic. They simply will not cover it. They will not allow editorials. They won't allow letters. They won't allow any discussion. So, and that is really this Kafkaesque, cocoon. And they've made it so that, Daniel Schulman wrote in the Columbia Law Review, or the Journalism Review, that for journalists, this is radioactive, that this is a career-ending controversy. So reporters won't touch it. No, everybody is scared of it. And, doctors won't come out. Doctors lose their license if they talk about this. The scientific journals won't publish on it, and because they get directly punished. Their revenues are largely coming from pharmaceutical companies. So they've effectively been able to shut off any kind of controversy. And of course, when you mushrooms and cockroaches need darkness in order to flourish, and that's what happens. And then they explode, their populations explode exponentially. So what we need is sunlight.
Yeah.
If you put a little sunlight on this controversy, the whole thing's going to fall apart. And that's all of my strategies: the lawsuits, the articles, the public statements, the demonstrations. Everything is about trying to have a debate in our democracy. And it's been, of course, it's very frustrating, but it's a phenomena. I've never seen anything like this in my life, where you're simply not allowed to talk about it. And the only places where it's being talked about, but it's on the social media, and it's all sub-rosa, and it's shows like this one, which will never air on HBO, will never air on the public media, on the mainstream media. It's all, and that's what we have to do. We have to get the social media so active that there's a crack, there's a break. The thing is that we will win this. Because all it takes is, there are many, many ways. It's like storming a fortress, and every time you storm, you lose troop. You're probing for that one crack. Right. And it could be just one editor of the Atlanta Constitution who says, you know what, we're going to do a series on corruption at CDC. Or a producer at 60 Minutes or the Today Show who says, you know what, I'm a journalist, I'm not going to be censored anymore. I'm going to allow a debate on this. Or it could be a lawsuit, a judge who says, I've looked at the facts in this, I know something about science, and there's something really screwy here, and I'm going to, allow William Thompson to be deposed publicly. It could be a congressman who subpoenas him before a committee and exposes the whole thing and forces debate. As soon as that debate happens, the opposition to this will shrivel. But that's what you need. You need sunlight, you need debate. We live in a democracy, and it's absolutely insane that we're not allowed to talk about this.
Do you feel like in the ranks that you described that this has become like a form of a religion, the vaccine thing, and that nobody can speak against it?
It's orthodoxy. And like all orthodoxies, it's cruel and it's often lethal. Mm-hmm. It behaves like, it's certainly not science. Nobody's looking at the science. Everything is taken on faith, and nobody's allowed to challenge it. Nobody's allowed to talk about it. Nobody's allowed to debate it. Mm-hmm. You have to accept the received knowledge of, these higher powers, which is CDC. Where else does the press allow, a government power to tell it what the science says? Why isn't a reporter actually reading the science and say, wait a minute, it doesn't say this at all?
Right.
And then anybody who questions that orthodoxy has to be destroyed. And you see this viciousness towards, the mothers of vaccine-injured children who are vaccine-hesitant parents. These people aren't naturopaths and crackpots. As they've been described,
right.
They're all marginalized and dismissed and vilified it's a very misogynistic, impulse, that because these are mainly women who are making these complaints, and these women know what happened to their child. Right. They brought a perfectly healthy 2-year-old into their pediatrician and got a battery of shots, and that night that baby spikes a fever, and this is a child who exceeds all milestones. And I've heard this story 1,000 times. In language and social interaction and athletic ability, that child exceeds his cohorts, his year class. And she brings him in at age 2. She gives them this battery of shots. A lot of these mothers were hesitant. They saw all these needles going to the baby. They questioned the doctor. The doctor says, okay. That night, the baby spikes a fever, maybe has a seizure, and over the next 3 months, the child is lost. They lose the ability to interact with their brothers and sisters, to point their finger, to make eye contact. They begin engaging in stereotypical behavior, the head banging, the flapping, the unrealized clapping, and they lose their language. They become nonverbal. They lose their toilet training, and now you have a kid who's, maybe at this point 14-year-old, still wearing diapers and wearing a football helmet and screaming in agony. And this was a totally normal child. That never happened in history before. There's no recording of this, in my generation. Nobody ever described perfectly normal children who suddenly regress into, intellectual disability. And these mothers who know what happened, they know, and they're dismissed as crackpots and naturopaths and hysterics and refrigerator moms and all this, all of these things that are said about these, instead of saying, wait a minute, this is the parent of an intellectually disabled child, and we ought to listen to her. We ought to hear what she's saying. We ought to not just dismiss her theories about what happened to that child. We need to listen, we need to examine, we need to scrutinize, and we need to see if what she's saying is true. But none of that happens. None of that happens. It's all that, this whole body of thousands and thousands of women are just dismissed, and you see what happens to them and to their families. And these were the women I was meeting on the road, and they're courageous and they're smart and they're well informed, and they know what the science says, and they've attended the meetings, and they've read the government documents, and they've read the Simpsonwood transcripts, and and they weren't anti-vaccine. They vaccinated their kid.
Right.
But they saw what happened. Part of this, and that's what happens in orthodoxies. Orthodoxies are cruel. Anywhere you see them, they're ultimately cruel. Because, we've got to be able to question things.
That's right.
We have to be able to ask the questions. And, science is not religion. And you can't just say, I believe in it, no matter what it says, no matter how mean it is, no matter how cruel it is, no matter how ruthless or damaging it is to children. We've just got to do what it says. We've got to obey CDC, the New York Times, listened to undeserving authority, to government officials in the run-up to the Iraq War. They had to apologize for it. Yeah. And the damage that did to our country, if that one paper had asked the questions at that time and applied the scrutiny that the press, that journalists are supposed to apply, we may have avoided that crisis, and we wouldn't be in Syria today, and Europe wouldn't be in disarray, and we wouldn't be bankrupt and all of these other issues.
You know, to me,
If they had done that, and what they've done, what that same paper has done with thimerosal is probably 10 times worse. Because, you know, there's 100 million kids a year that are being exposed to this, and the New York Times will not allow any discussion on it.
wow. As a final thought for the people who are watching this, and I'm somewhat in stunned silence, just listening to what you're saying, because the power of the thoughts is shakes me to my core because of the implications it has in our, not just today, but in our future and future generations. So people are watching this now. What actions should they take? What do you think people should do? How can they activate?
We're going to beat these people. I feel, listen, I've spent my life working on energy issues, and environmental issues, and global warming and rivers. But have taken a hiatus to do just this issue, because I cannot stand by and watch these children be poisoned. You know, an entire generation of kids that is being poisoned now by, government policies and greed, and we are going to take them on and beat them. And we need help. We're at the World Mercury Project. We need your support. We need financial support. We need members, because we're going to sue government agencies. We're going to sue pharmaceutical companies. We're suing the people. We're figuring out different ways to litigate this. But we need members in order for a charitable group to litigate. We need to show that we have members who have standing. Right. So, we need everybody to join up, to go to our website and to join, and then write the president.
Right.
Write the president letters. I know that President Trump actually is interested in this issue, and he reads people's letters who write him about this. Write him and write your member of Congress, and write to your newspaper, and try to get them to start covering this issue honestly.
So they can go to worldmercuryproject.org, and there they can sign up as a member, donate, and take.
And then we will also give you action alerts. We'll tell you things that you ought to be doing.
That's terrific. Well, can I just say, on behalf of myself and many, many other people who have a great interest in this issue, I want to thank you for all the work that you've done. I also want to thank you for letting us invade your home today and sit down and have this conversation with you, and allow us to record it and to share it with others. It's been very, very meaningful, and I know it's going to make a difference. So thank you.
Thank you.